Hi guys, Dr. Burns here. We're going to take a look at section 2.5 in this lesson, which is basically on looking at graphs, interpreting graphs, and knowing what to look for when we are dealing with graphs that are misleading, and what kinds of things would make a graph misleading. So make sure your cell phones are put away and out of sight so you're not distracted, and focus with me for the next few minutes. This is a real short video. First, I just want to recap what we talked about in the last few sections, and starting out with appropriate graphs. So what types of graphs do we use for what types of data? So notice that we've got a chart here, we've got numerical and categorical data, and I want you to remember there are different types of graphs we used for each one. Numerical data, my options that we said we could use in this class are dot plots or histograms. And for categorical data, we basically said that we could either use a bar chart or a pie chart, and those are going to be our two options. Similarly, along those lines, I want you to remember what the types of descriptions we use for describing each of those types of graphs. So when we have numerical data, remember that we looked at three things. We looked at shape, center, and spread. And with categorical data, there were two characteristics we would use to describe those, and that would be the mode and the variability. All right, so just a little summary of what we've talked about so far in this chapter. Now, what happens when we have a graph that is misleading? How do we know that we have a graph that's misleading? You know, anything that makes the graph difficult to follow, to understand, leads you to, or your eye, to believe one thing that's maybe not necessarily true, that would be considered a misleading graph. Well-designed graphs help us to see patterns and draw appropriate conclusions, but misleading graphs may lead to incorrect conclusions. And we see that, unfortunately, a lot of times in graphics we see online, infographics in the news, things like that. So what are some things that might be misleading? Well, if the vertical axis is not scaled correctly, so poor scaling on the vertical axis. And I apologize, I'll see if I can give you a little more room by the time you get the notes here. Generally, that means starting your y value at something other than 0, and that can cause us a problem. Using icons or pictures rather than bars. A lot of times journalists will do this, or you'll see this in articles, news articles, where they'll use cutesy icons instead of bars, and that's never a good quality. You want to avoid icons and pictures in general. And then sometimes using a vague research question that doesn't directly talk about the graph, but using a research question that is confusing or misleading or just too vague or too broad. Those can cause problems. So let me give you a couple of examples here. I was just kind of Googling and looking for some ideas of some things that would be misleading when we see them. So let me show you a couple that I found here that I thought were pretty good. This is one. Let me show you this. We've got a pie chart that's got some issues with it. I hope you notice. First thing I hope you observe with this is that the percentages add up to more than 100. That should never happen in a pie chart. The pie chart, the percentages, the wedges should always add up directly to 100. If they add up to something more than 100, that meant there were multiple responses. Researchers or respondents rather could choose more than one answer, for example, and then you would want to use something else to display that besides a pie chart. Also notice that it looks to me like these are proportional, and they look like the wedges are all about the same size. Now, these percentages are not that different, so that's probably why they did that, but there should still be a little bit of variation even if the percentages are relatively close. But they shouldn't be, because they shouldn't add up to 100. So that's really, I think, the biggest issue with that one. This one I thought was kind of interesting. It says we've got sports icons, and it looks like maybe ticket prices. I don't know, but they've used these different pictures, these icons to represent prices, and that's just a terrible graph. This would make much more sense if they used bars instead of these weird icons of the different balls for the different sports. So icons in general are just something you really want to avoid. Here's another one that looks like it's problematic. They're talking about home prices between 1998 and 1999. Notice that they did not start at 0 on the y-axis, so that's a problem. That makes it look like there's a bigger increase than there really is. That's the biggest issue. The other thing I would say is a problem here is this is really a bar graph. These are categories. 1998 is one category, 1999 is another category. But notice that the bars are touching, and that should not be the case either. That's not how a bar graph should be designed. So that's a problem as well. And we can look for some more in class, but these are some that tend to be a real problem. And so I wanted to show you those, and we'll talk about them some more in class tomorrow. So I'll see you then.